It's Game Boy World, and this is Hero Shuugou, Pinball Party. My family didn't own game systems until after the Atari crash. We sat out most of the so-called golden age of video games because the cost of consoles and computers at the time set them firmly in the luxury goods category. But my parents knew I had a real enthusiasm for video games, so they did what they could. Generally, that involved inexpensive, dedicated handheld systems. Now, we never owned a proper Game & Watch, but we did have Epic's double knockoff of both Game & Watch and Pac-Man called Epic Man. I also owned a few of those Mattel LED handheld sports games that came in plastic shells molded to resemble the paraphernalia of the sports they encompassed. But there was one other game I owned that I probably played more than any of the others combined, Parker Brothers' Wildfire Pinball. Mine was beaten all to hell. It was secondhand, and I'm pretty sure my grandparents found it left behind at the end of one semester in the dormitory they supervised. The provenance of the game didn't really matter, though. The important thing was, I had a working pinball video game, and I played it obsessively. In fact, having cut my teeth on this electronic simulation, I eventually found the reality of true pinball tables too alien for my tastes. Wildfire dates back to 1979, meaning it predates the Game & Watch series. And it predates the first true pinball game for a portable console, which was HAL's Fantastic Revenge of the Gator, by a full decade. The thing is, though, aside from the wacky alligators, Revenge of the Gator really wasn't all that much more sophisticated than Wildfire. On its native hardware, it was arguably worse. Sure, it had more dynamic and variable ball behavior than was possible with Wildfire's limited LED array, but thanks to the Game Boy's blurry screen, the ball was also much harder to keep track of, even in strong lighting conditions. By necessity then, Revenge of the Gator had to be kept fairly simple. Its triple-decker screen design added a little complexity to the proceedings, and it had some fun bonus modes. But really, at its heart, Game Boy's first pinball game wasn't much more complex than an LED game from a decade prior. Nor, for that matter, was its second, Jaleco's Hero Shuugou Pinball Party, released in Japan, and only Japan, in January 1990. In keeping with the pinball table spirit, Pinball Party had its own specific theme to help distinguish it from other video pinball endeavors. You can probably guess it from the title, which translates roughly into Heroes Assemble Pinball Party, a gathering of Jaleco characters playing pinball together. It honestly makes more sense than the alligator theme running throughout Revenge of the Gator, that's for sure. It's basically Mario Party before there was Mario Party, meaning there's really only a single minigame. Pinball. The main Jaleco crew featured here are Jajamaru-kun, the eponymous hero of the Japan-only arcade action series Jajamaru-kun that inspired retro game challenges Robot Ninja Hagoman titles, and there's also Rit, the heroine of Rodland, reimagined here as a Shinto priestess for some reason. Also included are a pig that I presume to be from the game Butasan, and a thing that almost but not quite resembles a car from City Connection. It's basically a whole lot of C-tier characters who never came to the US, hanging out in a C-tier pinball game that never came to the US. Pinball Party's main mode uses the same triple-decker table layout seen in Revenge of the Gator, with each failure dropping you progressively lower down the table. It's technically possible to climb back up to a previous screen, though terribly difficult. More interesting, however, is the extra mode, in which you deal with the more dynamic board hazards. While the extra table is only 2 screens high versus the basic mode's 3, it's much more interesting. The top half of the extra table features the game mascot, a leotard-clad magician's assistant whose name is never given, holding out a top hat from which a dragon occasionally emerges to produce a roaming monster. You can destroy monsters by directing the pinball into them, which will give you a moment's breathing room. Or you can simply drop to the lower screen to reset the creatures. Though here, too, returning to the upper area can be a bit of a task. If you stick around too long without destroying the top hat monsters, eventually they'll snag onto one of your flippers and cause it to vanish, which pretty much ruins your chances of entering the bonus rounds for that play. The lower screen is far more wild, with a roulette feature that introduces some unpredictable modifiers. The weirdest is when the flippers disappear, replaced by a breakout paddle, sometimes a normal paddle, sometimes a tether held up by Jajamaru and Rit. Livening things up is the usual assortment of bonus goals, like knocking down bumpers to spell Jaleco, and of course, a bevy of special stages. These special stages are essentially pinball-themed minigames, where you do things like defeat monsters or, yes, spell Jaleco. All of this is fine, and in fact, it would probably be a legitimately fun game if not for one crucial fact. Pinball Party is not very well made. You have to feel for Pinball Party. Outside of platformers, pinball is the first genre to see a second title on Game Boy. And unfortunately for Jaleco, the first game to come along was a high watermark. Revenge of the Gator was limited, but it was top-notch entertainment. Pinball Party is not. The game's biggest shortcoming? The terrible ball physics. The pinball in this particular party does not behave consistently. Its collision detection is sloppy and unreliable. Sometimes it passes partway into walls and objects, while at others it bounces or rolls a few pixels before it actually hits anything. Likewise, its momentum is impossible to predict. Sometimes it barely moves, while other times it goes flying across the screen. You never really know which it's going to be. On the other hand, despite the ball physics' Heisenberg-level degree of uncertainty, there are certain angles and paths that always seem to play out the same way every time. The awkward ball handling is problem enough, but it'll really grind your gears when you activate special bonuses in the extra game and suddenly the entire layout of the screen changes at the blink of an eye. While the transformation of the flippers into Arkanoid's Vaus is a cool concept, in practice it's likely to ruin your game. It happens instantly, and suddenly the ball is no longer rolling toward the flippers, but instead free-falling toward the bottom of the screen, and you have about a second to recognize the mode change and scoot the newly spawned paddle over to stop the ball from being lost. There's no warning, and there's no mercy. Pinball Party has some interesting ideas, but they're executed poorly in every instance. Again, it doesn't help that Revenge of the Gator already demonstrated how good a Game Boy pinball experience could be. If Jaleco had released this into a vacuum, it would probably be perfectly acceptable, but they didn't, and it's really not. It seems almost unfair to hold this up against a similar game produced by HAL, because technical excellence has always been HAL's stock and trade. The company got its big break when Satoru Iwata was summoned to help Nintendo figure out how to make its early NES games work decently at all. I don't think anyone's ever looked to Jaleco for game production expertise. And actually, who knows if Jaleco was even the publisher here? The game has no internal credits that I can determine, and no external studio has ever been attached to Pinball Party. Not that historians are necessarily beating a path to figure this out. But still, Pinball Party launched less than a month after another Jaleco pinball title, Pinball Quest for NES, which debuted in Japan on December 15, 1989. That particular game, it turns out, was produced by our friends at Tosei. Given that Tosei was a go-to for quick and dirty games, it would seem weird for the relatively ambitious Pinball Quest, which turned the pinball concept into an RPG-inspired adventure, to go to Tosei, while the more mundane Pinball Party would be an internal Jaleco project. But whatever the case, the close proximity of Jaleco's two pinball releases, the only two pinball games the company ever published, ultimately creates just another unflattering comparison for poor Pinball Party. It doesn't just stack up poorly against Revenge of the Gator, its mundane and uninspiring design compared to Pinball Quest really gets to the heart of the divide between the NES and Game Boy. But I suppose it doesn't really matter. Pinball Party never came to the US, and it's not exactly held up as a timeless classic over in Japan either. It's long since vanished, and justifiably so, into the waves of obscurity. It's just another one of history's countless lost games, produced by a defunct publisher and lacking any particular value aside from the novelty of seeing obscure 8-bit characters in a different context than usual. For more meaningless journeys into obscurity, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.